Since we're studying the sonnets and the middle period of Milton's life, I wanted to show you some pictures that relate to that. These are going to be all over the map in terms of chronology and subject matter, but bear with me. First, I thought Oliver Cromwell, the man with whom Milton worked, for whom he worked, who was essentially the dictator of the English Republic for some 10 years, from the death of King Charles I in 1649, the execution of the king, until Cromwell's own death in 1658. When Cromwell was succeeded by his son, Richard Cromwell, an inept leader who was quickly deposed by the returning King Charles II. Here in this contemporary portrait of Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, known as Old Ironsides, I think you can see why he was Old Ironsides. He has himself portrayed in a military costume in full armor with a essentially Puritan collar of simple linen, with long hair. Puritans were often thought to be wearing short hair, but in fact Cromwell wore his hair long, as Milton did as well. I think you can see in the eyes, the way Cooper has portrayed Cromwell, the determination that drove him to be a successful military general, a fierce colonizer of Ireland, a domineering dictator of England, and oddly, a proponent of liberty, which endeared Milton to him. You can also see in the portrait the effect of the famous statement by Cromwell, which you've heard in other forms but may not know its origin. When you paint me warts and all. And quite clearly, the warts are very apparent on this face, which is a no-nonsense face, part of his Puritan guise of straightforwardness. This is the title page to Tetrachordon, one of Milton's tracts on divorce. And I thought it might be useful to just look at this in terms of what these books actually looked like. We read his sonnet about Tetrachordon, commenting on the way the title may have scared people off in the bookstall. I don't think so, but in fact, I think they snapped it up. But here in Milton's sonnet, the stall reader, the person browsing at the bookstalls outside St. Paul's Cathedral, would say, "Bless us, what a word on a title page is this?" Tetrachordon, 4 chords, 4 places in Scripture which touch on marriage and on divorce, which are explained by Milton. You can see what is so uncommon today, that a title page, in fact, was a blurb as well as a title. So we have a long and varied description of the book, expositions upon the 4 chief places in Scripture which treat of marriage. Those places are actually labeled on the title page, as is the thesis of the book, wherein the doctrine and discipline of divorce, as it was lately published, is confirmed by, that is, as was lately published by John Milton in an earlier divorce tract, is confirmed by explanation of Scripture, etc. By the former author, J.M., well known who he was, but he does not put his name down. I'm not quite sure whether that's saving him from libel acts or not. He quotes Euripides in his in Greek on the frontispiece without translating it. There is no printer listed here, which keeps the printer, whoever it was that chose to do this, somewhat safe from attack. You can see by the carelessness with which the printing is done that this was a cheap production. The lines are broken that surround the title page, and it's not an elegant title page at all. It's out there in what Milton called in Areopagitica the wars of truth, and it doesn't have time to get fancied up. Here's the title page of Areopagitica, a rather bad reproduction, I'm sorry. Again, not a fancy title page at all. Here, the Euripides quote is in Greek, but is also translated into English by Milton. It clearly shows you what we learned in the introduction in the Greenblatt selections from Areopagitica, that it is envisioned as a speech. So this title page projects the genre of the or the mode really of the document. It is a speech. It fully lays out John Milton in large type. This was 1644. He's proud of this, and he wants to be associated with it. And it is addressed to the Parliament of England. The sonnets took us into the world of some of Milton's friends. Syriac Skinner, who wrote an early biography, the first biography of Milton, and Henry Lawes, whom we've met before, who acted the attendant spirit in Comus, was tutor in music to the Egerton Bridgewater family. So here's a portrait of Lawes after Sir Anthony van Dyck. Van Dyck was a great Dutch painter who found more work in England than in Holland, and has painted most of the figures of the middle 17th century in England, the great figures. It's a crummy reproduction of his painting, I'm sorry. You can see Lawes's, a little bit of Lawes's music as if attached or glued on to the painting in a sort of pretend gesture of that there's a piece of music that's been glued on. Of course, it's painted in. With this biography of Milton, we've encountered now his children, and particularly his daughters who survived him. His son died. And the story that when he went blind, that they that he used them to read to him, and he would dictate his poem to them, is told by Syriac Skinner and by his nephew Edward Phillips in early lives, and survived in a number of anecdotes. One anecdote says that Milton demanded that they read to him in old languages, Hebrew in particular, that they did not know, taught them only enough so that they could pronounce them. It's a site, this anecdote is a site that Romantic painters, poets, and essayists took very seriously. Milton had become an enormous figure by the Romantic period, by the late 18th, early 19th century, 100 years after his death. An enormous figure for any poet or artist to cope with, a kind of dreaded figure of skill and power. Nobody had written an epic like Paradise Lost to equal it. And I think this anecdote became a place in which some writers started to hack at the reputation of Milton, and justifiably. Whether this anecdote is true or not is an entirely different question. But in its mythological and its ideological inheritance, it's become a powerful one. This is the Swiss painter Henry Fuseli, lived in London, was born as a Swiss person, fascinated with Romantic ghastliness, and you can see this is a particularly ghastly view of Milton dictating to his daughters. Milton's eyes looking up, almost desperate, his face glum, his body contracted, in contrast to the beautiful curving figure of the daughter who stands at the podium taking down his dictation, and puts Milton literally in the shade, as a kind of ghastly zombie figure uh, uh, now, now, does the daughter seem imprisoned? Not, not. I think. In fact, she seems. Uh, if you didn't actually know what this was supposed to be, one could imagine it as a kind of muse figure. Um, but it's a figure. It's a picture engaging. I think the, the, the dictatorial qualities of Milton. The dictatorial qualities. Um, that's a pun, of course, on dictation and on dictator, thinking back to my first picture of Cromwell. Another version of this by George Romney, a more somber and less grotesque picture than Fuseli's, um, very much portrays the Milton as a lurking, black and enshrouded figure, um, staring at his daughters unseeingly with blank eyes, which we cannot see. The daughters in the light, but clearly cowed and bowed by the power of their father, who uh, seems like a ghostly figure outside of the outside of outside of the family circle, but engaged in a terrible kind of family politics. Lastly, uh, in some senses to counter, but to or in another sense to expand that vision, I wanted to show you William Blake's frontispiece to his poem Milton, a long poem late in Blake's life, in which Milton is the hero of a poem, the tormented and anxious hero, a Milton, probably essentially a spirit Milton living in some kind of afterworld, um, who breaks through the fires of that world. Here is Milton, naked, young man, strong, as many Blake wrote, described, painted many figures like this. Essentially, a kind of fierce energy bursting out of some kind of cloudy, fiery prison, walking through, seeing. Apparently, we see his eye, we see his open eye, we see clearly that he's forthright. He is walking forward, his right foot ahead of his left lifted on his toe, breaking through these clouds into the poem itself and into Blake's poem. Milton, Milton, the figure here, thrusts his right hand in between the two syllables of his name, M-I-L on the left and T-O-N running down the right, um, as if to break apart Blake's poem, um, as if he is the interpreter or the power which is going to drive this poem. Underneath Milton's feet is a great early line in Paradise Lost, the causation line, the reason for writing to justify the ways of God to man. So I think it's interesting to look at two painters from the same period, well, three, but let's just do Romney. Romney, an establishment painter using the biographical myth of Milton to establish him as a force of patriarchal terror, and Blake using rather a kind of personal mythology to turn Milton into a revolutionary form of, of, of energy, which is going to, if once reinterpreted by Blake, is going to perhaps burst through not only Blake's poem, but the politics of French Revolution period England